Education, Business, and Leadership for the African Woman in the 21st Century. Please utilize the chat feature at the bottom of your toolbar to engage with the speaker when prompted. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed all of the day's proceedings up till now. My name is Teresa Shaheen, and I'm honored to provide the closing remarks for day one. I am a senior lecturer in social entrepreneurship at the Yale School of Management, working on drivers of health. And one of the things that really stood out to me the most from this conference is how all the different sectors that we're talking about and areas of work are so interlinked, which is just like what we talk about in the drivers of health. We're talking about agency, health, education, entrepreneurship and economic access, gender parity and leadership. And none of these exist without the other. So all of these drive health, and health drives all of these. And one of the things I've noticed from the participants' comments and the conference content is really this interlinkage and the collective action. It's not only what people are working on in each different field, but it's also how they're all linked together. So I'd like to share some of the highlights that came to us from the surveys today in the session. And there were really 5 things that stood out from the audience. But before I dive into them, I'd like to invite you to also put your comments into the chat as I speak. And then I'll invite a couple of people to contribute their highlights, aha moments, and thoughts on these 5 main themes if we have time in the next 20 minutes or so. So the first point that came up is on collaboration. And this was actually a call for more collaboration from one of the participants. And this is something that really resonates a lot, especially when thinking about the interlinking of these different sectors. It's not only collaboration, I think, but it's all forms of collective action, which include collaboration and include private-public partnerships and other forms of working together. And collective action is really when, rather than each stakeholder having their own agenda and their own metrics for success, different stakeholders can come together and have a shared agenda and shared metrics of success. And this entails constant communication. It entails a backbone orchestrator, usually organization. And so I think that this is something that we could definitely be thinking about more in our work and in what we can take away from this conference to improve gender equity in Africa. Speaking about collaboration and collective action and collective impact, one of the things that I've been working on has been public-private partnerships with the Global Health Leadership Initiative at the Yale School of Public Health. And some of the themes that came up today really resonate with some of the research that we've come out with in the past year about the role of trust in partnerships for global health. And we found that different factors influence the evolution of trust in working together, and that these depend on the actual individual people involved, like many of the panelists said today. Like, it matters who's at the table. It's also the context that matters, and that's different from culture. So in different contexts in different African countries, we saw that people have a different mindset about certain topics. Like in some countries, people trust the private sector more than the government, whereas in others, they trust the government more than the private sector. So that was another thing that really mattered. And the third was results. How can you actually show results to build trust? And I think that a lot of our panelists today spoke about small wins and tangible results that you can use to build on in the future, not waiting for everything to change before you can produce something and measurable output. And finally, and most importantly, an alignment of value among the different stakeholders. And we also saw that there is a time factor, that trust evolves over time, and that there was a cross-cutting current of communications. So those are two things I wanted to mention related to the first theme that we took away from the highlights of the day, which was collaboration. That there's a framework for collective impact and how different people can work together, and that there are frameworks for building trust for public-private partnerships. And one last thing I'll say about collective impact is that sometimes it's really the unusual suspects that make a difference. And I think we saw that a lot today. For example, when tackling the opioid use epidemic in the US, when they were creating a collective impact framework, they didn't only bring together people who thought that they were working on youth substance abuse. They brought together people whose work touched this topic, even though it wasn't their primary mission, like educators, the police, healthcare providers, youth organizations, parents, schools, the Justice Department, etc. So if you think about any topic that we've been discussing today, whether agency, health, education, economic access, or gender parity in leadership, it's really about thinking, who doesn't think of themselves as someone who works on health? Who doesn't think of themselves as someone who works on agency? And how can we bring those people into our collective impact initiatives? Because really without them, we're not going to be able to create collective impact. So I think that that's really an important point to make. So moving on from the first highlight of collaboration, the second highlight or recurring theme was really acknowledging that this is a tough space to operate in. And I think that's so important to do. There's really a balance between being aggressive and ambitious and optimistic about the changes we can make, and between acknowledging that this is really tough and trying to find, are there recurring patterns and theme in the obstacles that we face? And how might we support each other in overcoming those obstacles? I think that perhaps we haven't been explicit enough about those obstacles and barriers within the context of creating change. It's like there's either people who are plowing forward to create change, or people who are discussing the obstacles and limitations and not providing solutions. But how can we really bring those together to say, here's our agenda, here's what has been shown to be some of the obstacles and barriers, and here's how we're going to support each other in breaking those down and incorporating them into our strategy so that they won't slow us down. Which brings me to the third highlight or pattern, which was that things move slowly. Sometimes we're overly ambitious and we just want to get it done, and when it doesn't work, we call it a failure. And failures are okay, and it's important to talk about failures. But at the same time, just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that it's not in the process of happening. It's just that these types of social challenges that we're tackling are not going to be solved overnight. They are sticky challenges. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. They wouldn't still exist. And so I think it's important to be ambitious and restless and have a sense of urgency, and yet acknowledge that things move slowly. And one of the great examples of a global initiative that may not have been mentioned yet today, I'm not sure if it was, is Catalyst 2030. And I wanted to mention it because they are looking for members and they are looking for partners. And Catalyst 2030 is a really interesting form of collective impact because it's not its own organization. It is a distributed entity, which meant that rather than start something new, they brought together existing networks and existing organizations to create this new initiative. And the mission of Catalyst 2030 is accelerating progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So based on current data, we're not going to reach the Sustainable Development Goals till 2085. And how can we accelerate that progress? So they have country chapters and monthly meetings between the members. And the way that they're accelerating the progress is by doing exactly what we're doing here today, is really bringing people together to think about where are we seeing movement, where are we seeing barriers, and how can we work together using a collective impact framework to accelerate the progress. The fourth point that really came out to me in participants' feedback was the importance of mentors and enablers. You know, people were asking, like, these amazing women in the panel, who are their enablers? And other people were saying, wow, this really brought up the importance of mentors. And I think that that is so true. And we talk a lot about the importance of funding and providing resources to women leaders and to those working on gender equity in Africa. And one of the resources that has been demonstrated to have the highest social return on investment and the highest impact on a person's trajectory is mentorship and enablers. How can we take this person's path and literally change the slope of it and make it exponential? A lot of the times it's by coupling whatever financial support they're getting with non-financial support. And I think and hope and know that the network that we're creating today through bringing everyone together in this conference and this convening will hopefully be a seed that we can build on to start expanding a network of mentors and enablers. I think that one of the things that we're very privileged to have here at Yale is the strong network of Yale alumni and faculty and philanthropists and all the resources at their disposal. And I think that it's not enough to bring people together to talk about progress and challenges, but what we really need to be asking ourselves is, how can we mobilize our network and the resources at our disposal to support people who are not here? That's how we can expand Yale's reach, not by starting new centers or bringing in fellows. I mean, all those things are important, but it's about by thinking about who is doing the work on the ground. What do they need? What do they think we need? Not what we think they need. And how can our strengths and what we already have support them and change their trajectory? I think we could get a lot more done if we think beyond the boundaries of this institution. Lastly, something that came up that was really interesting was the role of technology. And I think that's so important, the role of technology in really leveling the playing field and the gender disparities between men and women. One example quote that I pulled out from participants' feedback was that in Rwanda, we saw an economic boom after COVID due to the adoption of electronic payments among women vendors, which was very counterintuitive given the general negative impacts. And another one about health technology and being adoptable. So you can't wait for the status quo to change. You can't say, you know, as soon as the government changes or the internet changes or customers' ability to pay changes, then my technology will work. It's actually the other way around. It's technology as an enabler and as a status quo changer. Because really what we're trying to do here is change the status quo. So these are the 5 different points that really came out from participant feedback about what the highlights were of the day and the key recurring themes and patterns. Collaboration, acknowledging that this is a tough space to operate in, that things move slowly, the importance of mentors and enablers, and the role of technology in leveling the playing field. And I was chatting with Christine before the closing remarks began, and she mentioned also this undercurrent that's underlying all of these themes about this sense of urgency and this restlessness. And it reminded me of an article written by Julie Battilana in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which talked about 3 different ways, 3 different roles that people play in creating social change. And I invite each of you to think about what role do you play and what role could you play in the future? And there's not one that's more important than others, but it's just that she divided social innovation into agitators, innovators, and orchestrators. Are you the one that's agitating people and doing research about what's wrong and putting out policy briefs and, you know, getting all up in people's faces and just creating the movement, you know, getting like the dust up in the air for change to happen? Are you the innovator who's coming up with solutions and imagining different ways of doing things? Or are you the orchestrator who's saying, well, okay, in order to implement those solutions, we need to bring together all the different stakeholders? And any one person can absolutely play different roles at different stages in their trajectory. It's just something that I thought might be interesting to invite you to think about. So I'd like to invite at this stage any participants to chime in also about key highlights that you noticed, key aha moments that you had during the day, and key takeaways. So I'll give people a minute of silence to just think and reflect and process and synthesize. And then if you can just raise your hand on Zoom or put something in the chat, we'll invite you to mute yourself and chime in. Jacqueline, did you want to speak? Dr. Kikulu? No, I think that was a false alarm. So what were some of the highlights and aha moments that people had today in the various sessions? What key themes did you take away that you feel unified the different panels as they pertain to agency, health, education, entrepreneurship and economic access, and gender parity in leadership? Or what questions did you want to bring to the group? Christine, maybe I'll invite you to get the group.
Yes, I was trying not to be the first because I need to be the last. And please, guys, feel free to turn on your videos. It's not too late, I know, for many of you in the US. So, so I think one other aspect that was sort of broached in a couple of the panels that also my discussion table at lunch spoke on briefly, and something that's very personal to me, is the role of the diasporan. It's the idea of the returning diasporan. It's the idea of, should we have a role? Do we have a role? If we have a role, how do we play into advancing this cause across these 4 different themes? How can we do better? And I think, again, it was something that was touched on, but I think is something I think that will be a discussion that occurs more with greater synthesis over the next 5 to 10 years. But I look forward to some of those answers. I don't have all of them. I have some thoughts.
Too. And I think that, a lot of the narrative and dialogue these days on campus is really about lived experienced leaders. Like, how can we support the grassroots leaders on the ground who are living the challenges? And that absolutely needs to be front and center. And that's not to say that the people who are not there, who have access to other resources and other networks outside, don't have a pivotal role to play. And I think really that's where the role of the diasporan comes in, is in finding out what those lived experienced leaders need and connecting with them. And Christine, I really think that that's a role that Yale could play, because not every diasporan is going to have the time and resources to find out what lived experienced leaders need and connect with them. But if we can find that data and make those connections, then they can help mobilize resources. Tosin, do you want to go next? It's so good to see you.
It's great to see you. Hi, Christy, and everybody else. One thing that I found across the different sessions that I attended today was the role of mentoring and mentorship. I recall that in one of the session on the tech company, one of the moderator talked about how one of the panelists actually was one of her mentees. And then in the last session on Meet the Role of Media, Biola talked about how she's actually made use of the virtual space that COVID-19 has exposed us to mentor more people than she would have had the opportunity to mentor, and the role of mentorship in her own life, and also how she mentors other people. And it added on to, what Christina said, based on what you're saying about the role of, diaspora and Yale, also creating opportunities to bring mentors and mentees together. I mean, obviously this conference is one of such avenues, but just thinking for ourselves how we can both mentor people and be mentors as well in the different stages of our lives.
I think so too, Tosin. And I think, again, that's another role that our network can play. And what I'm trying to do is just mentally synthesize like action items for us as the Yale community, not just thought questions, but these are things that we can do, is mobilize the diaspora, is help build networks of mentors. And also, I think within communities where people don't think of themselves as mentors and they're too busy struggling and doing the work, but actually those are the most important mentors. So how do we create the space for them to play that role? In addition to just surviving and implementing their programs, like how can we support them in mentoring others, which is kind of like their only hope and not being the only ones implementing these solutions themselves. Do you know what I mean? I'm thinking of, a woman that I work with in Lebanon who is a social entrepreneur living and working in the refugee camp where she was born, and how her biggest, I think, potential to have a ripple effect is that all the younger women and girls want to be like her. And it's really like, how can we not only provide mentorship to her, but also activate her as a mentor in order to activate these young women as agents of change? I have another question that I'd like to ask people, and I put it in the chat, which is, we've been talking about our aha moments and highlights and things that really came out, but what are some of the frustrations that you're feeling in this moment, other than the fact that it's almost 4 p.m. and I'm hungry and I'm tired, but like in terms of things that have been awakened in you that are not feeling satisfied, that you'd like to focus on tomorrow and moving forward? And it's not necessarily that you have to answer now, but it's also a thought question for yourself. I invite all the participants to be thinking about both of these, things they took away and things they didn't take away and want to. Michael.
Thank you. Something that struck me in the last session on media, art, and culture, a comment from Akisa Omulepo, I believe, and she pointed out something that's both obvious and not, and that is, I think the quote was, Africa is not a monolith. There are many different stories. And I think for me, as a white male American sitting in New York City, I am susceptible to thinking of Africa rather than, I believe it's 54 countries with probably 250 cultures, in fact. I'm not sure how to frame the question exactly, but as this conference, which incidentally I think has been fantastic, proceeds, we talk about Nigeria, we talk about Kenya, we've talked about several other countries, Cameroon and others. Are we making a mistake, or how do we rectify that amorphous question that I haven't asked very well?
I think, Michael, it's not even that you have to ask a question, it's more that you're sharing a frustration, and I share this with you, and it's a caveat, right? Like, how are we having a conversation about an entire continent as if the entire continent is just a homogenous place that faces the same experiences and challenges and has the same solutions? Like, I used to work in Egypt. Technically, that's Africa. It's entirely different from sub-Saharan Africa. And then East versus West. And then even, you mentioned a couple of different countries, even within those countries, you have the capital cities versus the remote areas, and different lineages coming from different tribes and people speaking different languages. So I think, I'm a minute away from closing, so I definitely won't have an answer to this important point, but I do invite everyone to keep this in mind as we proceed into the second day of the conference, is really how can we think about the nuances within this continent and different places and peoples in it. I think that's one of our hugest paths to impact. So thank you very much, Michael, for bringing that up. And I think I need to close in the next minute. So I want just attend everyone so much for attending and participating. We're gonna have a short 5-minute break right now. And if you haven't already, please fill out the survey for this session. The link to the survey is in the chat box. And then we're gonna reconvene again in about 5 minutes for the beginning of the next poster session. So thank you everyone very much. It's so good to see you, and thank you for all your insights and highlights.